What does it mean to be Ukrainian?
That is a great question. That's something I ask myself every single day. Um, I I grew up asking myself that question. What does it actually mean to be Ukrainian? And I think Ukrainians are really all collectively asking themselves that question. It's it's something that arguably we've been trying to discover for the last 3 decades that we've seen in independent Ukraine. There, you'll get a different answer depending on really the age demographic that you ask, because I remember older Ukrainians, like my parents, my grandparents, their definition of what it means to be Ukrainian was very different. When they look at Ukraine, they would more look at it towards a cultural thing with holidays and, certain, you know, they look at it historically. They would probably more identify with certain values. Whereas now we're really seeing Ukrainians kind of go a little bit further, and language does play a big part into that. And there is a bit of I would say, a bit of conflict, almost debate, because you have a lot of older Ukrainians who speak Ukrainian, but it sounds a little bit different from, for example, the way I speak Ukrainian. And this is definitely something that was interesting for me to learn here, and especially when I got to encounter some of the very old diaspora, like in New Jersey, for example. That was something that I really realized when I would speak to them. They're a much older Ukrainian crowd. These are people who moved from Ukraine back in the 60s and 70s, and their concept of what Ukraine is so much more different, because back then the Soviet Union was really oppressing Ukraine quite heavily. Culturally, music was banned, even the languages to some degree restricted, whereas I think Ukrainian was only really taught as a secondary language in schools. And, their perspective of Ukraine is this one of resistance and resilience almost. Whereas, for me growing up, there was to some degree an established idea of what it means to be Ukrainian, what our culture is, what our value is, what our holidays are. We definitely would fight to kind of preserve and also recognize more of it, because so much of it was oppressed or suppressed from us in the past that right now we're really fighting to recognize like what is ours and what is Ukrainian. And I really do think it's like, as we speak, it's really just kind of, I don't want to say growing, maybe it's adapting, or it's really morphing itself into it. Like, Ukrainians are really learning right now what their identity is. And I wish there wasn't a war. I wish we could have done it in a time of peace, but we certainly are, especially in this time of great tragedy. We are really learning a lot about ourselves and what it means to be Ukrainian. I think the question of what it means to be Ukrainian is one that is answered on an individual basis. I don't really like the idea that, there's this one set of things that that's what it means to be Ukrainian. I ask myself what it means to be Ukrainian for myself and from my experience and what Ukraine is. I really do think that answer would almost it would have a similar answer as to, like, if you were to ask someone what it means to be an American. You're not going to get one answer from everybody. You're going to get something completely different from every person. And I do like that. I can tell you what it means for me personally.
Sure.
Yeah. And like, for me personally, the one person who really influenced my perspective on what it meant to be Ukrainian was my aunt, who was also my godmother. She unfortunately passed away from cancer. She battled it for 2 years, but she was always someone I looked up to, and I would ask her about Ukrainian history, about culture and music, and I would always speak to her about that. And I stayed with her over those summers that I would spend in Ukraine. And, to me, being Ukrainian is this kind of weird, it's like this weird almost idea of, it's like being a rebel almost. Ukrainians are anarchists by nature. That is a fact. That is one thing that I certainly learned. I know if you're a politician in Ukraine, you have to deal with the fact that you're in charge of a country of anarchists. Ukrainians, Ukrainians are really this free peoples that are hyper individualistic. They are very much so. Wow, this is a very complex question because I'm really thinking about it. The idea of, Ukrainians have this long history of just consistent fight and struggle for freedom and independence, and just sovereignty in general, and not just sovereignty for a nation, but individual sovereignty, where we can exist as a people with a language, with a culture, with a certain set of values, whatever that may be. It changes over time, and we have that right to exist. I think that's really the biggest thing when it comes to Ukrainian culture, is our constant struggle just to exist and be independent and not be told that you're someone else. Know that Ukrainians have been fighting for centuries, hundreds of years, to be able to say that we are Ukrainians. This is what Ukraine is. This is our history. And I think that's really what kind of engineered the modern concept of what, Ukraine is today.
Well, self-determination.
Self-determination, yes.
Yeah.
That's a great way to put it.
Reminds me a little of, in Palestinian culture, they have this term sumud, which is like steadfastness, hanging on despite difficult circumstances. So based on what you're telling me, that identity of resistance in the Soviet Union and then after is a piece of it.
Yeah. The best way I can do it is really compare it to because Russia also has that sort of history where they have a lot of great suffering and whatnot, but we see that today where it really turned into a culture of self-victimization where they take pride in that suffering, whereas in Ukraine, we've also had a very tragic and hard history, but I would say it really toughened us. It made us into these fighters really for really just trying to survive, to move forward, to, keep going. And we don't want to necessarily take pride in the suffering. Instead, we'd rather it guide us somewhere forward. We want to use it as something more than just saying, hey, we suffered, whatever, we're victims of this and that. No, we're going to look at our history and say, this happened to us, but let's do better and let's do what we can to really just to progress.